You arrive at the end of the last ice age without realizing it at first. The air is colder, sharper, carrying the last breath of a world that has been locked in ice for thousands of years. And beneath your feet, the ground is still unfamiliar, unstable, as if the planet itself has not yet decided what it will become. Sea levels are rising, coastlines are vanishing, entire landscapes are being swallowed by water, so fast that human memory cannot keep up. This is supposed to be the moment when humanity is barely surviving, when small groups cling to life with stone tools, wooden spears, and fragile shelters made of animal skins. This is where the story is meant to be simple, and yet, standing here, you sense immediately that something is wrong, because carved into this moment, this exact fracture between ice and warmth, between extinction and renewal, there is evidence of an ambition so vast that it does not belong here. Not in this time, not in this world. Around you rise pillars of limestone, each weighing as much as a modern truck, shaped with a precision that feels intentional, deliberate, and unsettlingly confident. These are not accidents, these are not experiments, they are statements. 12,000 years ago, when the textbooks tell you humanity was still learning how to survive, someone was already learning how to build forever. This is the first shock, and it lands quietly before it lands hard. You are not looking at crude piles of stones stacked for shelter. You are looking at architecture, monumental architecture, pillars rising 16, 18, even 20 feet high, each one carved from a single block of limestone, hauled, lifted, and placed with an accuracy that leaves little room for error. A mistake here would not mean inconvenience. It would mean catastrophe, months of labor lost, lives possibly crushed beneath falling stone, and yet they did it anyway. The second shock comes when you realize the scale. This is not one structure, not one bold experiment by a lucky or unusually gifted group. Beneath the ground, hidden under layers of soil and time, lies an entire complex. Circle after circle, hundreds of pillars. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that what we see today is less than 5% of what was built. Less than 5%. You are standing on the tip of something vast, something unfinished, not because it failed, but because it was deliberately concealed. And that realization forces a third shock, the most dangerous one of all. This place should not exist. By every rule you have been taught, this kind of construction comes later, much later. First comes agriculture, then food surplus, then specialization, then hierarchy, then religion, then temples. That is the order. That is the story. But here at the end of the Ice Age, the story runs backward. The temple appears first. The monument arrives before the village. The cathedral stands before the city. The timeline does not merely bend here. It breaks. Carbon dating confirms the age. Multiple samples, multiple tests. Peer-reviewed, the numbers keep returning to the same impossible window. Around 9600 BCE. This is not speculation. This is not fringe theory whispered in dark corners of the internet. This is confirmed, published, and deeply inconvenient reality. The oldest layers are not the crudest. They are the most advanced. And as you move upward through time, the sophistication fades instead of growing. History, here, flows in reverse. Try to imagine the world as it was then. Britain is not an island. It is still connected to Europe by a vast landmass now drowned beneath the North Sea. Mammoths and saber-toothed cats still walk the earth. Human groups rarely exceed a few dozen people, bound together by kinship and necessity. Survival is a daily calculation. There is no margin for waste, no room for vanity. And yet someone looked at this harsh, unstable world and decided to move mountains. Not metaphorically, literally. To quarry a single pillar of this size without metal tools, without wheels, without domesticated animals, requires not just strength, but planning, coordination, leadership. It requires hundreds of people working together toward a goal that offers no immediate survival benefit. You cannot eat a stone pillar, you cannot wear it, you cannot run from danger with it on your back. This was labor invested in meaning, not necessity. That alone should make you pause, because it suggests that before humanity learned how to farm, it had already learned how to believe. The belief did not emerge from comfort, it emerged from crisis, from a world collapsing under climate chaos, where ice was melting, seas were rising, and familiar patterns were dissolving. In moments like that, survival is not enough. You need explanation, you need order, you need something that tells you the world is still held together by rules, even as everything you know disappears. So you build those rules into stone. The pillars rise not as shelters, but as anchors. Anchors in time, anchors in reality, they say. This place matters. We were here, we understood something, and we refused to let it vanish with the flood. This is where the story becomes unsettling, because it forces you to reconsider who your ancestors really were. Not as naive wanderers stumbling blindly toward civilization, but as conscious actors responding to trauma, loss, and transformation with vision. These were not people waiting for history to happen to them. These were people trying to shape history before it escaped them. And perhaps that is the most disturbing inversion of all. The Ice Age ends, the world floods, and instead of retreating, instead of shrinking, instead of clinging only to survival, humanity's first great impulse may have been to build something sacred, something heavy enough to resist forgetting, something precise enough to outlast chaos. You are told that civilization begins with farming. But here, at this frozen edge of time, The evidence suggests something far older and far more dangerous. That civilization may begin with an idea powerful enough to force people to reorganize their entire way of life. An idea heavy enough to lift 20 tons of stone. And as you stand here, at the moment history turns back on itself, one question settles in and refuses to leave. If this is where the story truly begins, then how much of what you think you know is built on an assumption that never existed at all? From a distance, the hill looks unremarkable. It rises gently from the limestone plateau of southeastern Anatolia, its surface rough, scarred by erosion, scattered with broken stone, as if it were nothing more than a natural swell in the land. You could walk across it and never realize what you are standing on. In fact, for decades, people did exactly that. Archaeologists surveyed the region, took notes, logged coordinates, and dismissed this place as insignificant. A medieval graveyard, they thought, debris from a much later time. Nothing worth stopping for. That mistake alone should make you uneasy, because this hill is not natural, it is artificial. Every meter of its height is the result of human intention, layered deliberately, patiently, over centuries. What you are standing on is not a mound shaped by wind or time, but a mountain built by memory. And once you understand that, the ground beneath your feet no longer feels solid, it feels staged, as if the land itself is hiding something from you. The paradox begins with scale. This mound rises nearly 15 meters above the surrounding bedrock and stretches hundreds of meters across the plateau. For a hunter-gatherer society, this alone is absurd. These are people who are supposed to travel light, who follow seasonal migrations, who leave little behind because permanence is a liability. And yet, here is permanence made earth. Here is weight. Here's accumulation on a scale that suggests not movement, but anchoring. When excavation finally begins in earnest, the illusion of randomness collapses almost immediately. Just beneath the surface, mere inches below the soil, the flat top of a stone emerges, then another. Then the unmistakable silhouette of a T-shaped pillar, perfectly squared, its edges sharp enough to betray the hand of a master stoneworker. This is not rubble. This is not collapse. This is architecture waiting to be uncovered. As more soil is removed, the hill opens like a wound, and what it reveals feels deeply wrong for its age. Circular enclosures appear, each defined by massive limestone pillars arranged with geometric intent. These are not loosely placed markers. They are evenly spaced, oriented, balanced. Two towering central pillars dominate each circle, facing one another like silent sentinels, while smaller pillars ring the perimeter, embedded into stone walls and benches. The layout feels ritualistic, controlled, and above all, planned. This is where the hill becomes a problem, because nothing about it aligns with what this period is supposed to produce. There are no houses clustered around it, no hearths, no trash pits full of domestic debris, no signs of daily life as you would expect from a settlement. Instead, everything about this place feels singular, intentional, and separate from the mundane. This was not where people lived. This was where they went. And that distinction matters. The hill is not a village. It is not a fort. It is not a burial ground in the traditional sense. It is something else entirely. A focal point. A destination. A place designed to be approached, entered, and experienced. The kind of place that requires people to gather from elsewhere, to converge on a single point in the landscape for reasons that go beyond survival. That alone forces a revaluation of the social structure behind it. To bring people together repeatedly at this scale requires coordination, communication, shared understanding. It requires a reason powerful enough to override the instincts of mobility and self-preservation that define hunter-gatherer life. You do not drag 20-ton stones uphill because you are bored. You do not carve them into precise shapes because you have spare time. You do it because something demands it. And whatever demanded this was not small. Ground-penetrating radar deepens the unease. The enclosures you can see, the ones photographed, documented, and discussed endlessly, represent only a fraction of the site. Beneath the hill lie more circles. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds of pillars still buried, still untouched, still sleeping under layers of deliberately placed fill. This was not a single construction phase. This was not a brief experiment. This was a long-term project that unfolded over generations. And then there is the most disturbing detail of all. The hill was not formed by collapse or abandonment. It was created by burial. After these structures were built, used, and maintained, someone made a decision that defies modern logic. They did not let the temples decay. They did not strip them for stone. They did not walk away and forget. Instead, they filled them in carefully, methodically. Thousands of tons of earth, stone fragments, and debris were carried in and packed around the pillars until the enclosures disappeared completely. Sealed beneath an artificial mound. This was not destruction, it was preservation. The fill material tells its own story. It is clean, deliberate, lacking the chaos you would expect from refuse or collapse. The carvings on the pillars are protected, their edges still sharp after 12,000 years, because they were entombed by the very people who built them. Whoever buried this site knew exactly what they were doing. They understood time. They understood erosion. They understood that what they were sealing would outlast them. And that raises a question you cannot easily dismiss. Why would a society invest so much labor into building something monumental, only to invest nearly the same amount of labor into hiding it. The answer is not here yet, not fully, but the implication is unavoidable. This hill was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be remembered later, by someone else, at another time. When the world was different, seen this way, the hill stops being a ruin and starts becoming a message. It is a deliberate interruption in the landscape. A pause in history, engineered by people who understood that their present was unstable, that floods were coming, that climates were shifting, that knowledge could be lost. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They buried it in stone and soil, trusting that one day someone would uncover it again. Standing here, you are not just looking at the remains of a structure. You are standing on top of a decision made 12,000 years ago, a decision to close something rather than let it fade. The hill exists because someone chose memory over convenience, effort over erasure. And once you accept that, the question changes. This is no longer about how this place was built. It is about why it was hidden, and whether we were ever meant to find it at all. Once the shock of the hill begins to settle, a quieter and more troubling realization takes its place. It is not the stones that are the true anomaly here, it is the people. Everything you have just seen forces you to ask a question that archaeology once believed it had already answered. Who exactly were the builders? Because according to every conventional model, they should not have existed in this form. In the layers surrounding the earliest enclosures, the evidence is stubbornly consistent. There is no pottery, not a fragment. Pottery, that cornerstone of settled life, will not appear in this region for thousands of years. There are no signs of domesticated plants, no wheat fields, no barley storage, no grinding stones, worn smooth by daily use. There are no bones of cattle, sheep, or goats bred under human control. The animal remains belong to the wild gazelle, wild cattle, boar creatures hunted seasonally, not herded or managed. By definition, this places the builders firmly in the category we call hunt-gatherers. And that is where the logic breaks down. Hunter-gatherers are not supposed to build monuments. They are supposed to be mobile, flexible, and cautious. Their lives are structured around uncertainty. If food becomes scarce, they move. If conditions change, they adapt. They do not invest years of labor into immovable stone structures that tie them to a single location. Permanence is risk. Weight is a liability. Everything about their lifestyle favors lightness and speed. Yet here, permanence dominates. To quarry, transport, carve, and erect a single pillar weighing up to 20 tons without metal tools or draft animals requires an extraordinary concentration of labor. Engineering estimates suggest that moving one such block would demand hundreds of people working in coordinated effort. Not dozens, hundreds, and not for an afternoon, but for weeks or months at a time. Now pause and consider what that implies. Hundreds of people working together means hundreds of people who are not hunting, hundreds of people who still need to eat. Every day, calories do not disappear just because you are doing something meaningful. Energy obeys the same laws now as it did 12,000 years ago. A man hauling stone uphill burns thousands of calories a day. Multiply that by hundreds, then add children, elders, toolmakers, planners, and those injured or unable to work, and the numbers become staggering. This is not a casual undertaking. This is a logistical operation. Textbooks tell you that hunter-gatherers live hand to mouth. They hunt what they need, they eat what they catch. There is no surplus, no storage, no buffer for failure. If the hunt fails, people go hungry. That model cannot sustain a construction site of this scale. It cannot support specialization. It cannot feed architects, stone carvers, or leaders who are coordinating labor instead of throwing spears. And yet, somehow, it did. This is where the narrative flips, quietly but completely, because the evidence does not show agriculture preceding the monument. It shows the monument preceding agriculture. The builders did not wait for farming to organize themselves. They organized first. They built first. And only later does agriculture begin to appear in the surrounding region, almost as if it were a response to a new problem they had created. This reverses a foundational assumption. For decades, history has taught that surplus food enables religion, that once people have enough to eat, they can afford priests, rituals, and temples. But here, the sequence appears inverted. The need to gather, to build, to participate in something larger than survival may have come first. The belief system may have demanded organization. Organization demanded reliable food, and reliable food eventually forced the domestication of plants. In this model, farming is not the cause of civilization, it is the consequence. That idea alone is destabilizing. It suggests that belief is not a byproduct of comfort, but a driver of transformation, that people will reorganize their entire way of life not because it is efficient, but because it is meaningful, that the engine of civilization is not hunger, but purpose. Look again at the absence of domestic life at the site. There are no houses crowding the enclosures, no signs of permanent residence in the earliest phases. This was not a town, it was a destination. People came here from elsewhere. They gathered, worked, participated, and then left. This implies a network of groups spread across the landscape, coordinated not by territory or blood alone, but by shared ideology. To sustain such a system, there must have been leadership, not kings in the later sense, but organizers. Individuals who understood schedules, seasons, labor distribution, and perhaps most importantly, narrative. Someone had to explain why this work mattered, why it was worth the pain, the hunger, the risk. Someone had to convince people to return year after year to lift stones instead of chasing game. This is not brute force, this is persuasion, and persuasion is power. The builders of this place were not simply strong, they were socially sophisticated. They understood how to bind people together around a shared vision, they understood obligation, ritual, and probably reward. They understood that participation itself creates identity, that once you have helped raise a pillar, you belong to something that existed before you and will outlast you. This is the kind of social glue that turns scattered bands into a society. It also hints at hierarchy. Someone decided where the pillars would go. Someone dictated their shape. Someone oversaw the alignment, the spacing, the sequence of construction. These decisions were not democratic in the modern sense. They required authority, and authority does not emerge spontaneously. It is granted, earned, or imposed through belief. Seen this way, the builders stop looking like primitive foragers and start looking like something far more familiar. They resemble early organizers, early engineers of human behavior. They are experimenting not just with stone, but with people. And that experiment worked. For centuries, labor flowed into this hill. Skills were refined, knowledge was passed down, traditions formed, all without writing, all without metal, all without agriculture, at least in the beginning. This was a society balanced on an idea strong enough to hold it together against the natural pull of dispersal, which brings you to a final uncomfortable thought. If hunter-gatherers were capable of this level of coordination, planning, and symbolic complexity, then the line we draw between primitive and civilized is not just blurry, it may be meaningless. The difference is not intelligence, it is context, it is memory, it is whether the conditions exist for that intelligence to be expressed and preserved. The people who built these monuments were not waiting to become civilized. They already were, in a form we have forgotten how to recognize. And as you move deeper into this story, one realization becomes harder to ignore. If these people could organize themselves so completely without farms, without cities, and without kings, then the forces that shape human society are older, stranger, and more psychological than we have ever been comfortable admitting. Once you accept that the people themselves were capable of this, the next question rises naturally, and it is even more unsettling. How did they do it? Not in theory, not in metaphor, but in the physical, mechanical sense. Stone against stone, weight against gravity, precision against error. Because the deeper archaeologists dig into this site, the clearer it becomes that brute force alone cannot explain what you are seeing. Start with the ground beneath your feet. In most hunter-gatherer sites, the floor is exactly what you would expect. Dirt, compacted soil, maybe a thin layer of mud smoothed by repeated footsteps. It is functional, temporary, and easily replaced. But here, in the heart of the earliest enclosures, the floor is something else entirely. It is hard, smooth, watertight, a composite surface made from burnt lime, mixed with crushed limestone, polished into a continuous plane that resists moisture and wear. This is not accidental. To create burnt lime, limestone must be heated to extreme temperatures well over 800 degrees Celsius and held there long enough to trigger a chemical transformation. This is not something you stumble into by throwing rocks into a campfire. It requires a controlled process. Fuel, oxygen management, time, and intention. Someone understood that stone could be transformed by fire into something entirely new, and then used that knowledge to reshape the very surface people stood on. This kind of flooring will not reappear in the archaeological record for thousands of years. That gap should bother you, because it implies that a technical process was discovered, mastered, and then forgotten. Knowledge did not accumulate here. It peaked, and then it vanished. And this is not an isolated case. Everywhere you look in the deepest layers of the site, you find evidence of technical confidence that feels out of place, as if it belongs to a different chapter of human history. Now look up. The pillars themselves are not roughly hewn boulders. They are monoliths carved from single pieces of limestone, shaped into a consistent T-form across multiple enclosures. This uniformity matters. It means there was a standard, a shared template. Someone decided what a pillar should look like, and that decision was followed again and again with remarkable discipline. The T-shape is not arbitrary. Most researchers agree it represents the human form in abstraction. The horizontal bar is the head, the vertical shaft is the body. On several pillars, arms are carved in low relief, hands meeting at the front, fingers elongated, resting just above belts or loincloths etched into the stone. These are not decorations added later. They were planned from the beginning, carved while the pillar was still lying in the quarry, which brings you to the quarry itself. Just beyond the enclosures, carved directly into the limestone plateau, lie unfinished pillars still attached to the bedrock. One of them stretches over 7 meters long and would have weighed close to 50 tons if completed. It was abandoned mid-process, frozen in time, offering a rare glimpse into the workflow of the builders. They did not collect stones from riverbeds. They extracted them from the earth with precision, isolating massive blocks before shaping them where they lay. This tells you something critical. They were not improvising. To move a 20-ton pillar, even a few hundred meters across uneven, sloped terrain without wheels or draft animals, is a logistical nightmare. Wooden rollers are often suggested, but rollers require flat ground. The limestone plateau is anything but flat. It is fractured, angled, and unforgiving. To make rollers viable, the builders would have needed to prepare the ground first, leveling paths, clearing obstacles, perhaps even constructing temporary causeways. That preparation alone is a major construction project, and the challenge does not end when the pillar reaches its destination. In the central enclosures, the largest pillars are not simply planted into soil. They are set into sockets carved directly into the living bedrock. These sockets are shallow, precise, and unforgiving. If a pillar were lowered at the wrong angle, even by a few degrees, its center of gravity would shift, and the entire stone could topple, shattering months of labor in seconds. There are no marks of cranes, no evidence of pulleys, no metal fittings. This suggests a system of levers, wooden cribbing, gradual lifts, and controlled releases, coordinated by dozens or hundreds of people acting in unison. Such coordination requires command, timing, shared signals. It requires people who understand not just strength, but physics. And this understanding appears again in the stonework itself. Most Stone Age art is incised lines scratched into rock. Simple, forgiving. But here, many carvings are high relief. Three-dimensional forms emerging from the pillar surfaces. Predators crawl down the stone, limbs project outward. Depth is created by removing vast amounts of surrounding material, not by outlining shapes. This is a subtractive art form. To create a three-dimensional figure in high relief, you must visualize the finished form before you begin. Every strike of the tool is irreversible. One mistake, one crack in the wrong place, and the entire pillar is ruined. The presence of dozens of such carvings, executed cleanly and confidently, tells you this was not experimentation, this was mastery. And mastery implies tradition. You do not arrive at this level of skill spontaneously. It is the result of generations of practice, likely carried out on perishable materials like wood before being committed to stone. That earlier phase is missing from the archaeological record, not because it never existed, but because it did not survive. What you are seeing here is the final, monumental expression of a long-developed craft. This realization should unsettle you, because it means the builders arrived at this site already knowing what they were doing. They did not learn here. They applied here. Which raises an unavoidable question. Where did this knowledge come from, and how far back does it go? Every technical detail at this site points to the same conclusion. These people were not fumbling their way toward complexity. They were executing a plan using techniques that required foresight, discipline, and an understanding of materials that feels advanced even by later standards. And yet, this knowledge does not persist. As time moves forward in the layers above, the technology simplifies. Floors become rough, pillars shrink, carvings lose depth and precision. The confident hand fades. The techniques retreat as if the knowledge itself is slipping away, eroded not by time but by changing priorities. The most advanced engineering lies at the bottom, buried under tons of earth, sealed away by the very people who possessed it, which forces you to confront a possibility that runs against everything you were taught. What if technological progress is not a straight line? What if knowledge can be gained, perfected, and then lost not because it fails, but because the world that sustained it changes? What if the most sophisticated solutions belong not to the end of history, but to moments of crisis, when survival alone is no longer enough, and meaning becomes the real engineering challenge? Here, beneath stone and time, you are not looking at primitive technology, you are looking at a system that worked, a system that did exactly what it was designed to do, and then, for reasons still unclear, was allowed to disappear, buried not by ignorance, but by choice. At a certain point, the engineering stops being the most unsettling part of this place. Stone can be moved, stone can be shaped. With enough time and enough hands, even impossible tasks can be forced into reality. What truly changes the tone, what shifts this site from astonishing to deeply disturbing, is the moment the stone begins to speak back to you. Because these pillars are not silent. As the dust is brushed away and the light catches their surfaces at the right angle, shapes emerge. Not abstract scratches, not idle decoration, but figures carved with intention, repetition, and narrative weight. Animals dominate the stone, but not the gentle ones. There are no grazing herds. No scenes of abundance or peace. Instead, you are surrounded by predators. Snakes coil along the edges. Scorpions crawl across the surface. Spiders spread their legs. Vultures stretch their wings. Leopards bare their teeth, frozen mid-motion, as if caught in the act of descending from the stone itself. This is not art meant to comfort. The choice of imagery is consistent across the site, and that consistency matters. It suggests a shared symbolic language, one that everyone who entered this space understood instinctively. These animals are not random. They are creatures that kill, poison, consume, and watch from above. They represent danger, death, and the thin boundary between life and annihilation. To stand inside these enclosures is to be surrounded by threat on all sides, carved into stone so it cannot be escaped. This is an environment designed to affect you. Most early art we know from this period is incised simple lines scratched into rock, forgiving of air, easily abandoned. But here, many of these figures are carved in high relief. They project outward from the pillar surfaces, three-dimensional forms emerging from the stone as if they are breaking free from it. Creating this effect requires removing enormous amounts of material. You do not carve the animal, you carve away everything that is not the animal. That distinction is crucial. High-relief carving demands foresight. You must see the finished form in your mind before you strike the first blow. Every cut is final. There is no correction, no layering, no hiding mistakes. The fact that these carvings exist at all, and that they are executed with confidence and consistency, tells you something uncomfortable. The people who made them were not learning. They were performing at the peak of an already mature tradition. This is masterwork, not practice. And then there are the figures that are not animals. On several pillars, arms are carved in low relief, descending along the sides, hands meeting at the front of the stone. Belts or loincloths encircle the lower portion. But there are no faces, no eyes, no mouths. The pillars are human, and not human at the same time. They stand upright, taller than any person present, faceless bodies arranged in circles as if in assembly. This facelessness is not a limitation. It is a feature. By removing individual identity, the pillars become universal. They can be gods, they can be ancestors, they can be spirits, they can be something in between. The viewer is invited, perhaps forced to project meaning onto them. You do not look at a face and recognize an individual. You look at a form and feel watched without knowing by whom. This creates a subtle but powerful psychological effect. You are not alone in these enclosures, even when you are physically alone. The pillars stand around you, silent, faceless, permanent. They do not judge you with expressions. They judge you with presence. This is the architecture of belief made tangible, a space that enforces behavior not through walls or weapons, but through perception. And then, there is the skulls. Fragments of human skulls have been found at the site, bearing cut marks that indicate deliberate defleshing after death. Some show drilled holes, positioned in a way that suggests they were once suspended, likely displayed. This practice is not unique to this location. Skull veneration is known throughout the Neolithic Near East, often tied to ancestor worship. Faces were sometimes reconstructed with plaster, eyes filled in, features restored, but finding these skulls in a ritual complex changes their meaning. These were not private memorials. They were public symbols. Hanging skulls inside or near the enclosures would have been a visceral reminder of lineage, continuity, and authority. The dead were not gone. They were present, watching, remembering. This transforms the space into a bridge between the living and the dead, between the present moment and an ancestral past that refuses to stay buried. Seen together, the imagery forms a coherent emotional landscape. Predators on the walls, faceless human forms towering above, the remains of the dead integrated into the ritual space. This is not a religion centered on gratitude or abundance. It is not about celebrating the world as it is. It is about negotiating with a world perceived as hostile, unpredictable, and dangerous. The message is clear. The universe is not gentle. Survival is not guaranteed. Power exists, but it must be confronted, appeased, or controlled. And here is where the symbolism deepens. The animals are often shown in isolation, floating without ground lines or context. They are not part of scenes. They are icons, signs. This abstraction suggests that these creatures represent more than themselves. They may correspond to forces, seasons, dangers, or even events remembered through myth rather than record. They function as visual shorthand in a language we no longer fully understand. Stone becomes memory. What you are witnessing is not decoration added to architecture. The architecture exists to host the symbols. The enclosures are not neutral containers. They are stages. The carvings, the pillars, the space between them all work together to create an experience. To enter this place was not to admire art. It was to participate in a narrative that surrounded you completely. And that narrative was not optional. Everyone who entered would have been exposed to the same imagery, the same emotional cues, the same silent reminders of danger and authority. This repetition is how belief systems stabilize, not through explanation, but through immersion. You do not need to be told what to feel. The space tells you. This is where the site stops being impressive and starts being intentional, in a way that feels unsettlingly modern, because the builders understood something fundamental about human psychology. They understood that stories do not need words. They can be carved into stone, arranged in space, and reinforced through ritual. Once internalized, those stories guide behavior long after the ritual ends. Here, stone did not just endure, it instructed. And as you stand among these carved predators and faceless figures, surrounded by symbols of death, danger, and watchful presence, you begin to sense the true function of this place. It was not merely a temple, it was a machine for shaping human perception, a place where belief was not taught, but imposed through experience. And that realization prepares you for the next layer of the mystery, because once you accept that this site was designed to influence the mind, the question shifts upward away from the stone beneath your feet, and toward the sky above your head. At first, the enclosures seem circular, almost organic, as if they were shaped by intuition rather than calculation. That assumption feels safe, comfortable. Circular forms appear everywhere in early human construction, and it is easy to believe these were laid out by eye, adjusted as they went, responding to terrain rather than obeying a strict plan. For a long time, that is exactly what researchers assumed. Then the measurements were taken seriously. When the positions of the major enclosures were mapped with precision, something quiet but devastating emerged from the data. The centers of 3 of the largest and oldest enclosures B, C, and D do not sit randomly in relation to one another. They form a triangle, not an approximate one, not a rough suggestion, but a near-perfect equilateral triangle, spanning the site with a level of accuracy that cannot be achieved by pacing steps or eyeballing distances. This is the moment when chance stops being a viable explanation. An equilateral triangle requires intention. It requires planning. It requires a shared point of reference and a method of transferring measurements across space. You cannot accidentally reproduce equal distances at this scale. Someone had to decide where each enclosure would be placed before the first stone was set. The implication is subtle but profound. This complex was conceived as a whole, not built piecemeal over time. You are not looking at improvisation. You are looking at a blueprint. That realization alone reframes everything you thought you understood about this place. These builders were not responding to immediate needs. They were executing a vision, one that existed fully formed in the mind long before it existed in stone. And that vision did not stop at the ground beneath their feet. It extended upward. Orientation matters here. The central pillars of the largest enclosure are aligned with a care that feels deliberate, not symbolic in the vague sense, but functional. In the world of the 10th millennium BCE, the sky did not look the way it does today. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis precession shifts the position of stars over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. To understand the sky of that era, you must rewind time itself. When researchers do exactly that, reconstructing the ancient sky using astronomical software, patterns begin to emerge that are difficult to ignore. Certain pillars appear to face specific directions that correspond to notable celestial events at that time. One recurring candidate is the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. In that era, Sirius was reappearing on the horizon after a long absence, a dramatic and rare event that would have marked time, renewal, and cosmic order. Across later civilizations, Sirius becomes associated with rebirth, flooding, and divine timing. But here, at the very edge of recorded prehistory, its potential significance feels more primal, more urgent. A signal in the darkness that the heavens were changing, just as the earth below was transforming through ice melt and rising seas. And then there is the pillar that refuses to remain quiet. One stone, often referred to as the vulture stone, bears a dense arrangement of symbols that feel different from the rest. A vulture holding a circular object, a scorpion, other animals arranged not in isolation, but in relation to one another. Below them, a headless human figure. The composition feels narrative, as if it is recording something rather than simply representing it. When researchers compared these carvings to the reconstructed sky of the period, an unsettling correspondence appeared. The animals align closely with constellations visible around the time of a major climatic disruption, known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that struck the Earth just before this site was built. The scorpion maps neatly to Scorpio. Other figures align with known stellar patterns. The circular object held by the vulture has been interpreted as the sun. If this interpretation is correct, the stone is not art, it is data. It is a timestamp carved into limestone, a record of a cosmic event remembered long enough to be frozen into symbol. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that this pillar records the memory of a catastrophic encounter with debris from space, a comet or meteor stream that impacted the Earth and triggered widespread environmental collapse. This idea is controversial, and it should be. Extraordinary claims demand caution. But what cannot be dismissed is the intent behind the carving. Someone was encoding information. Someone believed the sky mattered enough to be mapped onto stone. Someone believed that what happened above had consequences below, and that those consequences needed to be remembered. This is not superstition in the crude sense. It is observation, layered with meaning. To track the movements of stars across decades, you need continuity. You need people whose role is to watch, record, and interpret. This implies specialization. It implies a class of observers, proto-astronomers whose task was not hunting or carving, but watching the sky night after night, year after year. Knowledge passed down orally, refined through repetition, embedded in story and symbol. This is the beginning of science, even if it does not look like science yet. The geometry on the ground and the patterns in the sky mirror one another. Order below reflects order above. By aligning stone with stars, the builders were not just measuring the universe. They were anchoring themselves within it. They were asserting that despite floods, extinctions, and chaos, there was a structure to reality that could be understood and replicated. This is where the site transcends function and enters philosophy. The idea that the world above and the world below are connected, that harmony in one can stabilize the other, will appear again and again throughout human history. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in traditions that speak of sacred geometry and cosmic balance. But here, it appears startlingly early, stripped of later theology, raw and immediate. The builders were not worshipping the stars in the abstract. They were responding to them, remembering them, encoding their movements and their dangers into stone so that the knowledge would not be lost if the world changed again. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all. If these stones are recording not just belief, but memory of a sky that once turned hostile, then this place is not merely a temple, it is an archive, a warning, a message sent forward through time by people who understood that the earth could betray them without notice. They built in stone because stone remembers longer than people do. And as you begin to grasp that the ground beneath you and the sky above you were once part of the same deliberate design, another realization settles in quietly. If this site encodes knowledge meant to survive catastrophe, then it was never meant for its builders alone. It was meant for someone else. For someone standing here long after the ice melted, after the floods receded, after the knowledge faded from living memory, someone who would one day look at these stones and ask not how they were built, but what they were trying to say. For a long time, this place was treated as an exception, a miracle, an archaeological outlier so strange that it could be safely isolated from the rest of history. A single hill, a single group, a single inexplicable achievement that flared briefly and then vanished. That framing was comforting, because it allowed everything else to remain unchanged. If this was a one-off, then the broader story of civilization could survive intact. That illusion did not last. As survey methods improved and attention widened beyond the hill itself, the landscape began to speak. What emerged was not another anomaly, but a pattern. One site led to another to several more, spread across the limestone plateaus and rolling hills of southeastern Anatolia. New locations surfaced, each bearing the same unmistakable signature. T-shaped pillars, predatory iconography, monumental stonework executed with the same disciplined hand. This was not coincidence. The growing cluster of sites revealed that the hill you began with was not isolated at all. It was central, a node in a wider network that stretched across nearly 200 kilometers. These places were not adjacent. They were not built on top of one another. They were deliberately spaced, occupying strategic points across the region, connected not by walls or roads in the modern sense, but by shared design, shared symbolism, and shared purpose. At this scale, the implications change completely. You are no longer looking at a temple, you are looking at a system. Among these sites, one stands out for how much it deepens the unease. Carved directly into the bedrock of a steep slope, its architecture feels more intimate and more psychologically charged than anything found before. Instead of freestanding pillars placed into sockets, the stone itself has been sculpted into form. Chambers hollowed from the earth, figures emerging from walls rather than standing apart from them. Here, the builders did not merely arrange stone, they transformed the landscape itself. Inside one chamber, a forest of upright pillars rises directly from the floor. Uneven, irregular, unmistakably phallic in form. They are not abstract, they are explicit. Overlooking them, carved into the vertical rock face, is a human head with an elongated neck, its eyes wide, its expression frozen somewhere between awareness and alarm. The head stares directly toward the entrance, and just below it, a carved channel slopes downward, suggesting that this space was designed to hold liquid, water, blood, something else. The effect is theatrical, almost confrontational. To enter this space would have been to submit to it, to step down into darkness, surrounded by stone forms that trigger instinct before thought, under the gaze of a disembodied presence carved into the earth itself. This is not a communal gathering space. This is a controlled environment, a place designed to overwhelm the senses. And it is not alone. At another site, a carved stone bench reveals something even more unexpected, a narrative scene. A human figure holding his own genitalia, flanked by snarling leopards, their bodies tense, their teeth bared. Nearby, another figure confronts a bull. These are not isolated symbols. They are interacting characters. This is storytelling rendered in stone. For the first time, the imagery shifts from icon to myth. These figures are not anonymous. They feel like protagonists. Heroes perhaps, or archetypes whose stories were known well enough that a single carved moment could evoke an entire narrative in the minds of those who saw it. This implies a shared mythology that extended across the region, one complex enough to be recognized without explanation. At this point, the idea of scattered hunter-gatherer bands becomes untenable. To maintain stylistic consistency across multiple sites, separated by such distances requires communication, travel, regular contact. It implies routes through the landscape that were known, used, and protected. It implies a shared language, or at least a shared symbolic system precise enough to transmit complex ideas without writing. You cannot coordinate the construction of monumental architecture across a region this large through gestures and coincidence. What emerges instead is the outline of a confederation, a network of groups bound together not by walls or armies, but by ritual obligation and shared belief. Each site may have served a different role within this system, some open and monumental, others hidden and initiatory, but all participated in the same cultural framework. This reframes the question of population density. A network like this cannot be sustained by a handful of families. It requires thousands of people spread across the region, moving seasonally, gathering periodically, and contributing labor to projects that outlasted any single generation. This was not a temporary alliance. It was a long-term investment in a shared identity. And here is where the final assumption collapses. For years, critics pointed out the absence of houses at the central sites as proof that these places were purely symbolic, visited only occasionally, but recent excavations have begun to reveal domestic structures near some of the outlying locations. Not crowded cities, but organized living spaces, areas for habitation, zones for waste, separation between ritual and daily life. This is planning. Space is being partitioned by function. Sacred here, domestic there. This is one of the defining characteristics of urban thinking, even if it does not yet involve permanent brick houses or city walls. The seeds of urbanism are present, growing not from farms, but from ritual gravity. The hill you started with now looks different. It is no longer this strange exception that challenges the rule. It is the visible summit of a much larger structure, most of which remains hidden beneath soil, vegetation, and time. A civilization without writing, without metal, without kings as we understand them, but not without organization, hierarchy, or power. Power expressed through stone. What you are seeing across this landscape is not the birth of civilization as a simple evolutionary step. It is a deliberate construction, a choice to bind people together through shared experience, shared fear, and shared meaning. The architecture is the evidence, but the civilization existed in the minds of the people who returned again and again to build, carve, and remember. And once you accept that this was a civilization one spread across a wide region, unified by belief rather than borders, the next question becomes unavoidable. How did such a system maintain control? Because coordination on this scale does not persist through goodwill alone. It requires mechanisms. Structures that shape behavior, enforce roles, and make belief feel inescapable. And those mechanisms, as it turns out, were not hidden in laws or texts. They were built directly into the stone. Once you begin to see this landscape as a coordinated system rather than a collection of ruins, a more unsettling pattern comes into focus. These structures were not built merely to impress the eye or honor unseen forces. They were built to shape behavior, to guide movement, to influence emotion, to control what people felt, thought, and believed the moment they crossed a threshold. This is not accidental architecture. It is psychological architecture. Start with access. You do not simply walk into these spaces. The entrances are narrow, sometimes awkwardly so, forcing the body to slow down, to turn sideways, to bow or crouch without being told to. This is the first act of submission, performed instinctively. Before any ritual begins, before any symbol is seen, the body has already been conditioned. You are no longer standing upright as you would in the open world. You are entering something that demands a different posture. That alone changes the mind. Beyond the entrance, light disappears. These enclosures were not open-air monuments in the way we often imagine. Evidence suggests that many were at least partially roofed. Wooden beams resting on the tops of the T-shaped pillars would have sealed the interior, turning daylight into shadow. Firelight replaces the sun. Vision becomes unstable, flickering, uncertain. Faces disappear. Stone shapes seem to move as shadows crawl across carved surfaces. In darkness, the brain fills gaps with fear. Now add sound. Circular stone walls do not absorb noise. They reflect it. They trap it. Low-frequency sounds, especially rhythmic ones, behave strangely in enclosed stone spaces. They amplify. They resonate. They vibrate the body as much as the ear. Archaeological studies at other megalithic sites have shown that drumming or chanting at specific frequencies can induce altered mental states, reducing activity in the brain regions associated with language and analytical thought. You stop thinking in words. You start feeling in patterns. Imagine standing inside one of these chambers as drums begin to echo. The sound bounces unpredictably, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The floor beneath your feet is stone. The walls press inward. The pillars loom, faceless and silent, their carved predators catching the light and vanishing again. Your chest vibrates with each beat. Your breath syncs with the rhythm whether you want it to or not. This is not worship as calm reflection. This is sensory overload by design. The imagery reinforces it. Everywhere you look, you are confronted by danger frozen in stone, snakes, scorpions, spiders, vultures, leopards. These are not decorative motifs chosen for beauty. They are threats. They trigger instinctive responses wired deep into the human brain. Even today, these shapes cause discomfort. In the darkness, amplified by sound and ritual, their impact would have been overwhelming. Fear is not a side effect here. It is a tool. And fear, when paired with authority, becomes obedience. The faceless pillars play a crucial role in this system. They resemble human forms but deny individuality. There is no face to read, no emotion to interpret. This ambiguity forces projection. Are these gods? Ancestors? Spirits? The mind cannot resolve the question, so it holds all possibilities at once. The result is a constant sense of being observed by something that does not need to reveal itself. This creates what modern thinkers would later call a panopticon effect. You behave not because you are being watched, but because you feel that you might be watched at any moment. Even when no living authority is present, the stone stands in its place, permanent, silent, unyielding. The skulls intensify this effect. Displayed remains of the dead, especially those of ancestors, collapse the distance between past and present. The message is unmistakable. The lineage did not end. The authority did not die. The rules were not invented yesterday. They were inherited. Breaking them is not just disobedience. It is betrayal of those who came before. This is how power stabilizes itself. Not through force alone, but through inevitability. And then there is movement. These spaces are not designed for wandering. They channel the body along specific paths, toward focal points, around central pillars, away from others. Some areas are visible from the perimeter, but inaccessible, creating separation between those who participate fully and those who observe from a distance. This division matters. It creates hierarchy without words. The initiated inside, the uninitiated outside. Those who know, those who wait. Authority is not declared. It is demonstrated through spatial privilege. Who is allowed where? Who can approach the center? Who must remain at the edge? This is control embedded in stone. The rituals performed here would have been exhausting. Physically, emotionally, socially. Participation meant labor before arrival, submission at entry, sensory overload inside, and reinforcement of belief through repetition. But exhaustion has a side effect. It bonds people. Shared hardship creates loyalty. Once you have endured something together, leaving becomes harder. This is social gravity. For hunter-gatherer groups, mobility is a safety valve. If conflict arises, people can leave. They can form new bands. But when you invest months or years into building a structure, when your identity becomes tied to a place, walking away carries a psychological cost. The monument anchors not just bodies, but relationships. The builders understood this. They were not simply creating sacred spaces. They were creating obligations, commitments, a reason to return, a reason to submit. Over time, this system transforms loose groups into a unified society, one held together not by walls or weapons, but by shared experience engineered through architecture. This is where the story becomes uncomfortably familiar, because these techniques did not vanish with time. They were refined, repeated, repurposed. Temples, cathedrals, palaces, stadiums all inherit this same logic. Control the environment, and you shape the mind, and you shape behavior. Here at the edge of prehistory, that lesson appears already learned. The people who built these stone chambers understood something fundamental about human nature. They knew that belief is strongest when it is felt, not explained. When it is embedded in the body through sound, movement, fear, and awe. They did not need writing. They did not need law codes. They built rooms that taught obedience. And once you see that, the question shifts again. Because control, even when effective, comes at a cost. Systems like this demand energy, food, labor, sustained participation. They require resources on a scale that hunter-gatherer life is not meant to support indefinitely. Which leads to the next fracture in the story. If this civilization was held together by ritual and psychological control, then what fed it? What powered it? And what happened when the cost of maintaining that system became too high? Every system, no matter how elegant, eventually collides with its own limits. The stone chambers, the rituals, the carefully engineered fear and cohesion, they all demanded one thing above all else. Energy. Not spiritual energy. Human energy. Calories. And this is where the most unforgiving law of all enters the story. A law that does not bend to belief or symbolism. Energy cannot be created from nothing. A single man hauling stone uphill for hours burns thousands of calories in a day. Multiply that by hundreds of workers. Then add the non-laborers, the elders, the children, the ritual specialists, the planners, the injured. The numbers explode. This was not a seasonal gathering of a few dozen people. This was a sustained operation that ran year after year, generation after generation. Hunter-gatherer, life is not built for this. In the traditional model, food acquisition is flexible. If the hunt fails, you move. If the landscape changes, you adapt. But monuments do not move. Ritual schedules do not adapt easily. Once the system is built, it must be fed continuously, or it collapses. The builders of this place found themselves trapped by their own success. The evidence of strain is written into the ground. The site is littered with animal bones in astonishing quantities. Gazelle dominate the remains, followed by wild cattle and boar. These were not occasional kills. They represent large-scale, organized hunting events. To harvest this much meat, hunters could not rely on chance encounters. They needed systems drives, traps, mass slaughters, timed to seasonal migrations. This was hunting on an industrial scale, but meat spoils. Protein alone cannot sustain a workforce of this size over long periods. You need carbohydrates, you need storage, you need predictability. And predictability is the one thing a wild landscape does not guarantee. This is where a quiet transformation begins. Chemical analysis of stone vessels at the site and nearby locations has revealed traces consistent with fermentation byproducts. The implications are subtle but profound. Fermentation requires grain. Grain requires gathering in large quantities. Large-scale gathering creates pressure. Pressure creates experimentation. And experimentation, over time, leads to domestication. In this model, agriculture is not born from hunger. It is born from obligation. Ritual feasts become competitive displays of power and generosity. Leaders gain influence by providing abundance to host larger gatherings. They need more grain. To secure more grain, They begin to manipulate the environment, planting seeds closer to the site, watering them, protecting them. Slowly, almost accidentally, farming emerged, but this solution carries a hidden cost. As agriculture takes hold, the human body begins to change. Skeletal remains from later layers show signs of decline. People grow shorter, bones weaken, teeth decay from a diet heavier in starch. Diseases spread more easily as populations become denser and humans live closer to animals. Security increases, but freedom decreases. The system stabilizes, and in doing so, it tightens its grip. With stored food comes ownership. With ownership comes guarding. With guarding comes hierarchy. Someone controls access to the surplus. Someone decides who eats and who waits. The ritual specialists who once mediated between humans and unseen forces now mediate between people and resources. This is the birth of the elite, and it changes everything. As focus shifts toward fields and storage, the great stone projects begin to suffer. Labor that once flowed into monument building is redirected toward planting and harvesting. Skills that required years of apprenticeship are no longer passed down. The master stoneworkers are needed elsewhere. The vision that unified the people starts to fracture under the weight of daily necessity. The archaeological record captures this decline with brutal clarity. The earliest layer of the site, the deepest, the oldest is the most advanced. Massive circular enclosures, towering pillars, precision stonework. As you move upward through time, the structures shrink. Circles become rectangles. Pillars drop from 18 feet to 5 or 6. Carvings lose depth, complexity, confidence. The floors revert from polished stone to packed earth. This is not progress. It is regression. Knowledge is being lost faster than it can be replaced. The society that once coordinated hundreds of people around a single vision begins to splinter. Ritual spaces become smaller, more private. What was once communal turns inward. Authority weakens or fragments. The center no longer holds. And then, something extraordinary happens. Instead of abandoning the site to decay, instead of stripping it for stone, the people make one final collective decision. They begin to bury it. Thousands of tons of soil, limestone fragments, and debris are carried in, not dumped, placed, packed. The enclosures are filled carefully, from floor to ceiling, sealing the pillars where they stand. This is an act that requires planning, labor, and time. It is not the work of a panicked population fleeing disaster. It is deliberate. Why bury your own sacred center? There are several possibilities, and none of them are comforting. Perhaps the rituals had reached a natural end, their cycle complete. Perhaps the belief system that once unified the people had become dangerous, too powerful, too costly to maintain. Perhaps new generations, shaped by agricultural life, no longer understood the meaning of the old symbols and chose to close the door rather than risk misuse. Or perhaps they were afraid. Afraid of the forces they believed they had summoned, afraid that the portals they opened, symbolic or otherwise, could not be safely left exposed. Burying the site may have been an act of containment, a way to suppress something that no longer fit the world they were creating. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. By burying the site, they preserved it. The carvings remain sharp, the floors intact. The pillars standing as they were 12,000 years ago. The final act of this civilization was not construction, but curation. They sealed their knowledge in the earth, trusting that time itself would protect it. And in doing so, they left behind a haunting message. This was a peak they could not sustain. A moment when human organization, belief, and ambition aligned perfectly and then collapsed under its own weight. The greatest achievement of this society lies not only in what they built, but in the awareness that led them to walk away. They reached the summit first. And then they descended, taking their secrets with them, leaving only stone and silence behind. At the end of this story, the pace must slow, because what remains is not a mystery to be solved, but a realization to sit with. The stone chambers are quiet now. The rituals have ended. The drums are silent. The people who lifted the pillars, who carved the predators, who aligned stone with sky, are gone so completely that even their names have dissolved. And yet, what they built is still here, waiting. That alone should give you pause. What you are looking at is not a failed experiment. It is a paused one. A civilization that reached a level of organization, symbolism, and technical mastery far earlier than we are comfortable admitting, and then chose whether through necessity, fear, or wisdom to step away from it. They buried their greatest work not in shame, but with care, as if they understood that exposure would destroy it, and concealment would preserve it. This changes how you see the past. History is often taught as a straight ascent, a steady climb from ignorance to knowledge, from simplicity to sophistication. But the stones tell a different story, one of cycles, of peaks reached too early, valleys endured too long, and knowledge that does not always survive the societies that create it. Progress is not guaranteed, memory is fragile, and civilization, once built, can just as easily be forgotten. Perhaps that is the true message sealed beneath the hill. These people lived through catastrophe. They watched climates collapse and coastlines vanish. They understood that the world could change faster than tradition could adapt. So they did what humans have always done when faced with uncertainty. They tried to remember. They tried to anchor meaning in something heavier than water, stronger than wood, more patient than flesh, stone. And in doing so, they sent something forward in time. Not instructions, not answers, but a question. If human beings once organized themselves around belief, symbolism, and shared experience powerful enough to move mountains without writing, without metal, without kings, then what, exactly, are we capable of now? And what might we be in danger of forgetting, even as we congratulate ourselves on how far we have come? The wind still moves across the plateau. The soil still hides most of what was built. And beneath it all, the pillars wait, not accusing, not instructing, but present. A mirror held up across 12,000 years, asking you to consider whether history is something we master or something we keep relearning, again and again, from the ruins we leave behind.